Good afternoon. We have a Russian end of presidency press conference. We have today we're a little bit limited with the time, only half an hour. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon once again. Given that the time and things that happened during the week were dense and packed and tense, I think that we do not have time for a regular wrap-up as usual. But I'd rather come directly to Q&A. Q&A, given that we have a 3 o'clock meeting in the Security Council. Please.
Thank you, Fedor. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for doing this. My question is, Ambassador, do you feel isolated on the world stage today? And also, have you seen the French draft resolution in the Security Council on Ukraine, of course, in the situation, the humanitarian situation? And if yes, are you planning to support this? Thank you so much.
We don't feel isolated, at least myself. There are a lot of countries that understand what the Russian position is and what it is doing and why. We have briefly seen the text of a French draft. It was not formally introduced. I think it will be introduced today by the French ambassador, and then we will see where we will go from there.
Hi, Ambassador.
Technical difficulties?
Yeah, sorry. We're good. Thank you. Thanks for the briefing. A bit of a follow-on, actually, from Valeria on Ukraine.
From whom?
From Valeria.
Okay.
On Ukraine. President Putin started this describing it as a special military operation in eastern Ukraine. It's now spread across most of Ukraine. How would you describe what's happening on the ground now? And the UN, Michelle Bachelet, has said that more than 100 civilians so far have been killed, and yet you're saying the Russian troops are not targeting civilians. How do you feel about defending the Russian military when civilians are being killed? Thank you.
The Russian president didn't say it was a special military operation in Donbass. He said it was a special military operation in Ukraine. Look, we have to understand what is happening. We have to go back into history, and that doesn't start and didn't start even in 2013, 2014. The Ukrainian conflict and the situation has a long history which dates back those years. But when there was a anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in 2014, and the Ukrainian authorities started to persecute those who were not. Would you allow me just a second, because I need to answer this call, please?
Answering a call during press conference. That's interesting. And why is everything so laggy?
Have undertaken another hostile action against the Russian mission to the United States, to the United Nations, grossly violated to the United Nations. Just received information that the U.S. authorities have undertaken another hostile action against the Russian mission to the United States, to the United Nations, grossly violating their commitments on the host country agreement that they undertook, telling us that they are announcing 12 people from the personnel of the Russian mission, persona non grata, and demanding that they will leave by the 7th of March.
7th of March?
Yes,
So
UN diplomats. They just visited the Russian mission, and gave us a note prescribing us to do what they demand. You know that we were raising with the Secretary General the issue of the arbitrage with the host country, which grossly violates its commitments on the host country agreement. So far, it has not been done, but I think it's high time already. This is just hot news that arrived at my attention right away. That's why I took the phone. Sorry? 12 diplomats, yes. Sorry?
Who are they, and who are the most? Who's the most?
I don't know
senior?
the names yet, but the number is 12.
And
Sorry?
Yeah, is he included? Oh.
None of you, at least. Coming back, this is sad news, and again another demonstration of gross disrespect of the host country agreement to their commitments, as I said, within the framework of their obligations both under the UN Charter and the host country agreement, and Vienna Conventions, obviously. So coming back to Ukraine, I said that.
sorry, can we just ask one more thing? Did they give a reason?
Sorry.
What was their reason?
I don't know yet. I haven't seen the note. We will give you update as soon as we have more information. Coming back to Ukraine, as I said, the conflict
guess
has a
he's
long
feeling
history. It
isolated
didn't
now.
start in 2013 or 2014, but 2014 marked a landmark, a threshold from what was growing and ripening slowly in Ukraine all those years after their independence, and resulted in a constitutional coup and the war of Ukrainian regime against its own people who protested and who were opposed to what the Maidan regime was trying to implement. For 8 years, we've been trying, unfortunately in vain, to make Ukrainian authorities to comply with the Minsk agreements, and we went out of the way to do so. But from day one, after 2015 in particular, the Ukrainian authorities opted to sabotage first, and then simply to deny and to cancel, to abandon and to cancel their commitments under the Minsk agreements. Before that, they were trying to navigate, so to say, within Minsk agreements, trying to make them the way which suited them, but then it became obvious nothing works. And then in February, in January and February 2022, when the West started to beef up Ukrainian state with lethal weapons, when Ukrainian authorities amassed 120,000 servicemen at the border of the contact line with Donbass, and when they upscaled their provocations against Donbass, shelling and killing people again, we realized that leads us nowhere, and that's why President Putin took the decision to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk republics and to offer them within the treaty that we concluded with them military assistance. And that's why we started this military operation in Donbass and in Ukraine, which, as I said today in the General Assembly, was not the war started by us. This is the end of war that was started by Ukraine. I think that you all know that we many times we said that we were not planning military operation in Donbass unless Ukrainian military, Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian military would directly threat those republics, which was the case, and we have credible information that the military operation was planned, and that was a move that was inevitable in these circumstances.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the briefing. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. There have been some reports out of the border meeting in Belarus between Russia and Ukraine. What is it, in your view, that would bring peace to Ukraine and withdrawal of Russian forces. What is that? And then a little follow-up to Valeria's question. Country after country are coming to the General Assembly podium and supporting Ukraine, feeling that Russia is the aggressor. What is your view of that, if not isolation? Thank you so much.
Okay. What will bring peace to Ukraine? We clearly said, and that is demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, which creates a clear and immediate danger to us. Also within the context of geopolitical stability,
danger to us.
because as President Putin said, that if not today or tomorrow, one day in 30 or 50 years, Ukraine
how
might
everyone sees
and
Russia
will
now.
perhaps become a NATO member. That will move NATO to the Russian border, and that will be an existential threat for us. And that is something that we will not allow to happen. What will bring
Russia is existential
what
threat
will
to everyone in Eastern
what
Europe.
will bring peace to Ukraine unanswered? I answered on the talks that were held on the border of Ukraine and Belarus were finished at this stage. The result, the details of that are not known to me, but I know that there was a decision to continue those talks. When and where, I do not know yet. Perhaps in the same place.
There was some report that there was common ground.
I don't know the details, as I said, but I know that today President Putin spoke to President Macron, and he listed those conditions that we demand from Ukrainians, and they are well known. As I said, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, commitment to its neutral status, not to join NATO, and not to move weapons to our borders. I didn't answer one question that Michelle posed to me, which is about reports about 100 civilians dead. There are a lot of reports today, and I said that there are a lot of fake news. There are a lot of fake factories that produce those news. We do not have credible reports on civilian casualties. Of course, war is a bad thing, and anything can happen. But to call this, to consider those reports credible, is very difficult, since we are witnessing and we are encountering massive propaganda campaign, using, as I said, troll factories that produce those news, to which we referred to in our recent statements on numerous occasions.
So you just referred to this as war. This is now war?
This is a special military operation, which is commonly called. I wouldn't call it a war, because war means an outright military hostilities. But as you know, we announced it and we maintain it, that we are only targeting military objects in Ukraine. We do not target any civilian infrastructure, nor the cities, as they report.
This is insane.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sherman Briceby, South African Broadcasting. Can you talk about your relationship with the Secretary General, right? We saw you in the General Assembly on Wednesday. You had a very animated discussion. We couldn't read lips, but we certainly saw the body language. There's been a lot of criticism. And the UN argues that essentially all he's doing is defending the UN Charter that says states must settle their disputes through peaceful means, which is not happening here. So that's one issue. What should the SG do in this instance? And in addition to that, this notion of the denazification of Ukraine. Ukraine has a Jewish president. So it just beggars belief that you are talking about Nazis in removing Nazis in Ukraine when the president himself is a Jew.
There was a criticism on my part, on our part, of the Secretary General for the position he took on the crisis. I do not recall, as I said to him directly and out loud, that he took similar positions in similar cases, and there were many, in fact. Syria, take other examples. There were many where his position was much more subdued, but there was no body language. Rest assured, that was a criticism within the diplomatic protocol, which I think I didn't overstep. On the fact that Zelensky has Jewish heritage, it doesn't matter because real power in Ukraine, real political weight, belongs to the radicals and neo-Nazis who defy the president, who have their own agenda, who rule the ball in Ukraine, in fact. And President Zelensky, who came with a landslide victory of 74% of the population, promising to end the war, first thing on the list of his priorities. But then he was slowly backing off this, and he finished practically playing into the hands of those radical and neo-Nazi organizations, which claim that they represent the patriotic part of the Ukrainian society. He demonstrated that he's weak, that he has no political will and power in the circumstances he found himself in, to resist those radicals who are the main political driving force in today's Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Why is it so laggy?
A follow-up on Russia's calling it an existential threat if Ukraine were to join NATO. Russia is already neighboring NATO countries, so why would Ukraine becoming another NATO country make it more of an existential threat than it already is in your eyes? And secondly, there has been a lot of talk by European leaders about how Russia's invasion, aggression on Ukraine is going to change the European security architecture, not just today, but for decades to come. I wonder if you could comment on your reaction to that. Thank you.
Yes, we are neighboring NATO countries, and that was the result of cheating by our Western partners who at a time when the Berlin Wall collapsed, and at the time of the reunification of Germany, were telling us that they would not move beyond borders of the former GDR. And our naive leadership at that time, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, opted to believe them about it. Now our Western partners are vehemently denying that there was any of such I wouldn't call it even commitments or pledges, even promises. But documents revealed tell us that that was the case. And again, the naive Soviet leadership believed in it. Now we are ripening the fruit of this naivete, and having indeed NATO countries at our borders. And we know that that there are that the NATO infrastructure is moving towards Russian borders as we speak. That they are conducting exercises right on the border of the Russian Federation. We've been offering NATO to come to an agreement to move our troops, even for the exercises, at a certain distance, not to provoke each other. And that appeal has been addressed to NATO a long time ago, to which it never reacted. I remember the last conversation between Lavrov and Stoltenberg here in New York at the high-level segment the General Assembly in 2021, when at repeated reminders by Lavrov to Stoltenberg about that issue, he was evading the question. He was simply evading the question, as NATO did, and all the countries did. So the presence of NATO infrastructure around our borders and in the close proximity to it, of course, it is a threat to us, which is geopolitical. That's why we offered to the USA and NATO to engage in serious dialogue on security guarantees. That offer was made as early as recently as I think October, November this year. We sent our proposals in that regard, which included expansion of NATO, non-placement of weapons close to our borders, and moving NATO back to where it was in 1997, which would be, in our view, a fair solution and would bring us to the state of the security architecture, which would be beneficial for all the participants. But we received a reply which basically denied all our ideas in that regard. We were told that any country has a right to choose their allies freely, of course, meaning Ukraine first of all. But as we said, they are forgetting about another thing to which they committed in the OSCE summits on the indivisibility of security, which says that security of one country cannot be reached at the expense of the security of the other, and that was a commitment, not just a paragraph in a joint statement. Russian invasion to change European security architecture. I think NATO has changed European security architecture already back after 1997, when it started to expand to the east, contrary to their promises, unfortunately not commitments.
Could you switch on the mic, please?
Sorry. Thank you, Ambassador. Camilla Berglund reporting for Norwegian media, VG. The war is costing more and more civilian life. Today you have bombed Kharkiv and there has been several explosions in Kiev. What are you doing to prevent civilian casualties during your war on Ukraine?
I already said that the reports that are dubbed credible may not be credible at all. We have regular briefings by our Ministry of Defense, which maintains that we are not targeting civilian objects in Ukraine, nor the cities as such. So these reports about bombing of Kharkiv or explosions in Kiev should be verified. We strongly doubt, given the number of fakes that are spreading these days about the issue, as I told you. Explosions in Kiev is not true, because if there are any explosions, these are in the suburbs of Kiev, as far as I know, and they refer to the military infrastructure that the Russian armed forces are targeting.
But we have reporters on ground reporting that there are Russian bombings in Kiev. So
in Kiev, I do not have this information. We saw some footages of buildings partly destroyed, but it was then said and confirmed by our military that it was not our missiles, but either a plane of Ukraine or a wrong missile that went into that building. We didn't bomb residential areas of Kiev.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'm Katsujiro Inoguchi, Japanese TV Asahi. So you say this is a military operation, not a war. So when and how do you end this operation? And is there a scenario where you would use nuclear weapons?
How do we end the operation? I said what President Putin said on it. As soon as we have understanding from the Ukrainian authorities that they are prepared to demilitarize it and to denazify, if I may use that kind of a verb in English, that'll be a step towards the end of it. On the use of nuclear weapons, God forbid it, but President Putin ordered to put our nuclear force on high alert because we saw some disturbing statements from NATO leaders in that regard in relation to Russia. So that is a kind of deterrence that we're exercising.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this. We noticed recently that Kuwait supported the draft resolution condemning Russia. Lebanon condemned Russia, but the UAE abstained on that very draft resolution. And the UAE is just taking up the presidency of the Security Council. What do you expect from UAE and the Arab countries regarding this this crisis? And is Russia going to respond to the latest step by the U.S. by expelling 12 diplomats? Thank you.
What we expect from the UAE during their presidency, we expect that the UAE will uphold the integrity of the office of the presidency and that it will conduct it in a smooth way and according to, we know that UAE has a strong diplomatic school and we know their staff and I'm sure that they will do it hopefully with flying colors in the present circumstances. What was the last question?
How is Russia going to respond to that?
Well, I'm sure that the response will follow because it's a diplomatic practice which provides for a tit for tat. It's not our choice. We didn't initiate it, and I think that the answer will be given, but it's not for me to decide. I have to apologize to you. We are finishing our press conference. Sorry that it was short today, but I think you will bear with me because of the circumstances.
Ambassador, are these diplomats who are being expelled diplomats whose visas are coming to an end?
Sorry?
Are these diplomats whose US visas are coming to an end?
I didn't understand.
As in, are their visas running out and they have to leave anyway, or?
So look, we have many diplomats in the mission who do not have visa extensions. They can stay in the U.S. and continue their job. What they cannot do is to leave they can leave the country, but that's 100% guarantee that they will not come back because they will not get their visa extensions. Who of those 12 have valid U.S. visas today and who are not, I have no idea yet because I didn't see the names.
Okay, we appreciate any further information you can share. Yeah.
Okay. Guess that's good. And they could have had a longer press conference. There were many more questions they wanted to ask.
Qatar. Of Qatar.
I would like to inform you about yet another hostile step undertaken by the host country to step against the Russian mission. Just now, literally an hour ago, we were informed that from the Russian mission, 12 of its staff are being expelled. This is yet another gross violation by the host country of the UN agreement with the host country, of the Vienna Convention, and etc., etc. We have been saying for a long time that we need to start an arbitration procedure on the implementation by the host country of its obligations to maintain normally functioning missions and permanent representations to the UN. Unfortunately, this arbitration to date has not been begun. We keep being told about the need for diplomacy, diplomatic solutions, and at the same time our opportunities to conduct this kind of activity are being restricted. We deeply regret this decision, and we'll see how events develop within the context of this decision. We now have an unofficial meeting now, but I can see that the U.S. representative has asked for the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to take a quick minute. The status of the 12 diplomats you refer to, I don't think is really the proper subject for this meeting, especially given the gravity of what we're here to discuss, which is untold humanitarian suffering in the country of Ukraine. But since you have raised the issue, I will just ensure my colleagues that the step that the United States government informed the Russian mission of today was taken in full accordance with the headquarters agreement that we signed with the UN, and that those diplomats that have been asked to leave the United States were engaged in activities that were not in accordance with their responsibilities and obligations as diplomats. So under Section 13B of the headquarters agreement, they have been given a request to depart this country so they do not harm the national security of the host country. And I look forward to taking the issue up, Mr. President, where it properly belongs, which is the host country committee. Thank you very much.
Indeed, our meeting is not on this, but we do have our own opinion on this, and the explanations which I heard from the representative of the United States are not satisfactory to us. The 8,983rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated 28th February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian
Terrorists in Syria, Nazis in Ukraine. I don't think it's about Nazis. Yeah, everything is so laggy.
Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Mr. Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda.
February 28th. So
and I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Okay.
Mr. President, I speak to you from Geneva, and wherever you are in the world, we have all been watching the military offensive in Ukraine with a sense of disbelief and horror. As we feared, as we all feared, civilians are already paying the price. The scale of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure, even in these very early days, is alarming. Humanitarian needs are growing at an alarming pace in the hardest hit areas. Civilian children, women, and men have been injured and killed. Homes have been damaged and sometimes destroyed. As of yesterday, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 406 civilian casualties, including at least 102 dead in these few days. The real figure could be considerably higher, as many reported casualties have yet to be confirmed. We know, and we will hear, of course, much more from Filippo, that at least 160,000 people have been internally displaced across Ukraine, fleeing for safety. We know that figure is likely to be much higher, potentially a significant proportion of the entire population. And of course, as Filippo will tell you, we believe more than 500,000 refugees have been forced to choose to flee their country in search of safety. So families are separated. The elderly and people with disabilities find themselves trapped and unable to flee, not even able to get that small comfort. The picture is grim and could get worse still. Aerial attacks and fighting in urban areas are damaging critical civilian facilities and disrupting essential services such as health, electricity, water and sanitation, which effectively leaves civilians without the basics for day-to-day life. Bridges and roads have been destroyed, cutting off people's access to critical supplies and services. The use of explosive weapons in urban areas carries a high risk of indiscriminate impact. This is of particular concern in places like Kiev and Kharkiv. Civilians will undeservedly suffer the most from these attacks on densely populated urban centers. It follows. All parties must respect international humanitarian law, take constant care to spare all civilians and civilian objects from harm throughout their military operations. A party should also, of course, avoid the use of wide area explosive weapons in populated areas. And the longer this goes on, the greater the cost will be for civilians. Children will miss school and face a greater risk of physical harm, displacement, and unimaginably severe emotional stress. Women, so often disproportionately affected by conflict, as we have so often discussed in this chamber, will be at even greater risk of gender-based violence, and women and children may be exposed to other forms of exploitation. The economy of Ukraine could implode, which will further exacerbate humanitarian needs and create a ripple effect that travels far beyond Ukraine's borders. Already the upheavals in recent days are deepening a pre-existing humanitarian crisis. 8 grueling years of conflict in eastern Ukraine had already left 3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance on both sides of the contact line in the Donbass region. And it goes without saying that humanitarian needs are now much greater, including the large-scale displacement to which I've already referred, across and beyond the entire country, and not only in one region thereof. Humanitarian workers are doing their best to respond. The UN has expanded its humanitarian presence in Ukraine. We shall continue to do so. We're working to ensure we can scale up our operations as quickly as possible, and we had been preparing for this for some time. I must say that for the last 3 days, however, our movements, the movements of our dear colleagues in Ukraine, have been seriously constrained as a result of ongoing fighting and our inability to receive assurances from the parties to the conflict that humanitarian movements will be protected. And only this evening, I was fortunate to receive the beginning of some assurances to that effect. We must hope that comes into reality. In the meantime, local organizations and institutions are doing, as usual, the truly remarkable job that they do in all such situations, responding to needs. Local NGOs and the Ukrainian Red Cross, are working tirelessly to support civilians and evacuation operations. Health workers working day and night to care for the injured. Aid organizations providing psychosocial support to traumatized children, delivering first aid kits. And we're all here this afternoon to support their efforts. Medical services, including sexual and reproductive health services for drinking and hygiene, shelter, 19 organizations, partners, humanitarian organizations, are operating in Ukraine, able to provide some form of humanitarian assistance, though clearly stilted in these particular days. Right now, we urgently need progress on two fronts if we want to reach more people with aid that they need, that they deserve. First, we need the assurances from parties to the conflict that humanitarian workers and movements will be protected even during the most severe days of the conflict and not waiting for the conflict to subside. Even now, even today, even yesterday, we need to provide those protections to those workers to do the job that they want to do. Under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure the freedom of movement of humanitarians, a point we have been making in many different ways in these past 4 days. Secondly, of course, we desperately need more resources. Tomorrow, the Secretary General will launch a humanitarian appeal for this crisis with two components: a 3-month flash appeal for the situation inside the country and a regional response plan for the situation outside under the leadership of Filippo Grandi and his office. The Secretary General, alongside Filippo, our NGO colleagues, and I, will all call on member states to show support with quick, generous, and flexible funding. And cash will be a major source of delivery of humanitarian assistance in the particular circumstances that obtain in Ukraine. But this is certainly not enough. The lives of millions of civilians are simply at stake. We know from other recent conflicts how brutal, deadly, and protracted urban warfare can be. We know how countries' economies can be devastated, infrastructure, investment, and development gains set back an entire generation. And we know enough to know that we do not yet know what it will be the consequences of the events that we observe today. These things should never happen in any country, anywhere. Every effort, of course, must be made to de-escalate the conflict. The hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have taken the decision to leave their homes, to seek safety elsewhere in their country or beyond, and those, even more of them, who remain at peril for the loss of basic services, of pensions, of support, of the services their children need, of the safety of a day that may come and may not. I reiterate finally, Mr. President, the Secretary General's call for the only thing that we must all pray for, an immediate cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Filippo Grandi.
Mr. President, greetings from Geneva. Today and in recent days, you have heard that the United Nations humanitarian organizations, together with their NGO partners, have remained in Ukraine.
5,000 watching.
Let me start by saying how proud I am that we decided to do so, just
Not
like
that
we
many.
did in Afghanistan a few months ago. But naturally, as we just heard, our colleagues on the ground, like the rest of the civilian population, are now caught up in this deadly conflict. Many of them were relocated, and military attacks might force them to move again. Yet, they're still striving to deliver help to people in need whenever a small window of relative security allows for humanitarian aid to be distributed, working with partners, including especially national NGOs, often in extremely dangerous circumstances. But we know that we're not even scratching the surface to meet the needs of Ukrainians, including an unknown but surely very substantial number who have been forced to flee their homes over the past days. The situation is moving so quickly, and the levels of risk are so high by now that it is impossible for humanitarians to distribute systematically the help that Ukrainians desperately need. I therefore echo as well the urgent call made by the Secretary General and just a few minutes ago by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and by others indeed. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected and spared, and humanitarian access must be granted for those delivering aid to those impacted by war. A failure to do so will compound the already extraordinary levels of human suffering. Mr. President, in addition to the grave situation inside Ukraine, and as Martin just told us, hundreds of thousands are seeking refuge in neighboring countries. They need safety and protection, first and foremost, but also shelter, food, hygiene, and other support, and they need it urgently. As we speak, there are 520,000 refugees from Ukraine in neighboring countries. This figure has been rising exponentially, hour after hour, literally, since Thursday. I have worked in refugee crises for almost 40 years, and I have rarely seen such an incredibly fast rising exodus of people. The largest, surely, within Europe since the Balkan Wars. Over 280,000 have fled to Poland. Another 94,000 to Hungary. Nearly 40,000 are currently in Moldova. 34,000 in Romania. 30,000 in Slovakia. Tens of thousands in other European countries. We're also aware that a sizable number have gone to the Russian Federation. I want to commend the governments of receiving countries for allowing refugees access to their territory. The challenge to admit and register, to meet the needs and ensure the protection of those fleeing are daunting. But so far they have been met, though I am seriously concerned about the likely and further escalation in the number of arrivals. Mr. President, we may have just seen the beginning. So my message today is one of gratitude to the governments of Ukraine's neighbors, and also through them, my heartfelt thanks to the citizens of those countries, ordinary Poles, Hungarians, Moldovans, Romanians, Slovaks, and citizens of other European countries have undertaken extraordinary acts of humanity and kindness. This is the humanitarian instinct that is so needed in times of crisis. I encourage governments to continue to maintain access to territory for all those fleeing. Ukrainians, of course, but also third country nationals living in Ukraine, people there to work and to study, and in some cases, people that are in Ukraine as refugees, and all of whom are now similarly forced to escape the violence. At this critical juncture, there can be no discrimination against any person or any group. I'm aware that the European Union, its member states, and other governments have already provided countries receiving refugees from Ukraine with bilateral support, which I hope will continue. UNHCR, with its United Nations partner agencies and national and international NGOs, is present in all these countries, and we are scaling up. We encourage host countries to avail themselves of our support and expert advice as they address the situation and uphold their international obligations. We're helping and can do more in areas like protection and registration, organizing reception capacity, providing emergency relief and cash assistance, and in identifying and responding to the needs of the most vulnerable, many of them women and children, including a growing number of unaccompanied and separated children. Mr. President, I regret to say that unless there is, as Martin said, an immediate halt to conflict, Ukrainians will simply continue to flee. We're currently planning, I repeat, planning, for up to 4 million refugees in the coming days and weeks. Such a rapid increase would be a huge burden for receiving states and would no doubt stress reception systems and related resources. Like all countries hosting refugees around the world, they cannot be left alone to shoulder this responsibility. I therefore welcome the support expressed by many European states at yesterday's European Union Justice and Home Affairs Council to activate the Temporary Protection Directive for people fleeing Ukraine. This would enable, if activated, immediate and temporary refuge in the European Union. It would also facilitate the sharing of responsibility for people fleeing Ukraine among European states. As Martin mentioned, we will launch the UN Humanitarian Appeal for Ukraine tomorrow for activities both inside and outside the country. Private citizens and companies from around the world have already offered extraordinary financial support through thousands of donations, over $40 million to UNHCR alone in a couple of days. And I'm counting on governments to do the same, and quickly. Ukrainians and countries hosting refugees from Ukraine cannot wait. Finally, Mr. President, a reminder that Ukrainian refugees, like all others, and please let us not forget the continuing plight of Afghans, of Syrians, of Ethiopians, of the Rohingya people from Myanmar, and of many others. All of them never wanted to be refugees. They never wanted to be forced to flee their homes, and they all hope to return to their country as quickly as possible. It is not very often that I get to brief the Security Council. Let me take this opportunity, therefore, to echo what I said to the Council the last time you invited me a few months ago. Resourceful and experienced, the growing in numbers and gravity around the world. Innocent Ukrainian civilians huddled in bunkers. Veil.
I guess there's nothing of substance will be said.
Mr. President, I thank Mr. Griffiths and Mr. Grandi for their statements. The humanitarian consequences of the Russian offensive in Ukraine are tragic. The number of civilian victims, including children, continues to increase. Cities are being bombed. Civilian infrastructure is being destroyed. Around 500,000 people have been obliged to flee and take refuge in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Moldova. This figure continues to climb hour by hour. We hail the solidarity that neighboring states have demonstrated. Russia, a permanent member of this council, is violating the most essential principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Russia is trampling on international humanitarian law and human rights. It is riding roughshod over the Geneva Conventions. France reiterates its call for an immediate stop to hostilities, which must go before any peace talks. The protection of civilians, including children and humanitarian personnel, as well as civilian infrastructure, is an absolute priority. There is no compromise on this. We reiterate our call for safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all people in need. We have a shared responsibility and a moral duty, that of assisting the Ukrainian population. France and its partners in the European Union stand firmly beside Ukraine and its population. The European Union has already announced 90 million euro in humanitarian assistance. France is also doing its part. It has just sent 33 tons of humanitarian assistance to Poland to help Ukrainians and is preparing to ship over 30,000 tons of humanitarian assistance to Moldova. We hail the United Nations launching tomorrow of a flash appeal for Ukraine and a regional refugee response plan for Ukrainians. We call all member states to provide financial support, and we also welcome the Secretary General's appointment of Mr. Amin Awad as United Nations coordinator for the crisis in Ukraine. The European Union sanctions adopted against Russia and Belarus will be implemented in full respect for international humanitarian law, and we will ensure that they have no impact on the humanitarian response. Mr. President, France, with Mexico, will present a draft resolution to the Council calling for full respect of international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians, and unobstructed humanitarian access in order to respond to the urgent needs of the Ukrainian population. It will be brought to a vote very quickly. France hails the courage of the people of Ukraine. Within the United Nations and in every institution, France will continue to mobilize with its partners to support the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor to Mexico.
Señor Presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We thank High Commissioner Grandi and Under Secretary Griffiths for their reports. The figures that were just shared with us and the scene described are the reflection of a humanitarian situation which is becoming increasingly grave as the hours go by. This is why, amongst other actions, Mexico and France will present a draft resolution which overall will seek a cessation of hostilities, the protection of civilians, and guaranteed access for humanitarian assistance. We deplore the fact that there are continued clashes in densely populated cities such as Kharkov, Kiev, Odessa, and others. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas is unacceptable. Mr. President, we are also very concerned at the fact that broad sectors of the population are deprived of electricity, water, and access to basic infrastructure. The communities that are becoming isolated are facing a lack of food and medicine. Health services should be conserved at all cost. We call for opening access to all humanitarian workers without restrictions so that they can provide services. As we have heard, hundreds of thousands of people have already been displaced both within Ukraine and as refugees in neighboring countries. Although these figures are very preliminary in nature, they already are alarming, and they are going to escalate very rapidly. We have to be vigilant when it comes to this increase in the days, weeks, and months to come, perhaps even the years to come. We call for keeping the borders open, as has happened with great solidarity, so that all those seeking protection can find it, and so that the principle of non-refoulement be respected. Although we recognize the right to legitimate self-defense of countries, it is also concerning that there is a substantial increase in the flow of weapons and the impact that this flow will have on the civilian population. We acknowledge the efforts of the Secretary General, including the creation of the SURF, and we are grateful for the economic commitments that several states already have made. Ukraine needs international economic solidarity today in order to respond to its urgent humanitarian needs. Lastly, Mexico clearly calls on all parties to respect international humanitarian law, particularly the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the first additional protocol of 1967, as well as international human rights law. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Martin Griffiths and High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the distinguished representative of Ukraine. Mr. President, the humanitarian suffering in Ukraine is unnecessary and uncalled for. Kenya offers its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflict in the last few days. We regret the mounting casualties, the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced and those who are exiting Ukraine as refugees, and the growing damage to civilian objects and infrastructure. Mr. President, we commend the UN for swiftly stepping in to provide humanitarian assistance. We also commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees. We give a special thank you to Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia for working with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to enable Kenyan citizens in Ukraine visa-free entry. Mr. President, in the unfolding emergency, there have been disturbing reports about the racist treatment of Africans and people of African descent seeking to flee Ukraine to safety. The media is covering these appalling incidents, and several states have confirmed that their citizens are suffering such treatment. We strongly condemn this racism and believe that it is damaging to the spirit of solidarity that is so urgently needed today. The mistreatment of African peoples on Europe's borders needs to cease immediately, whether to the Africans fleeing Ukraine or to those crossing the Mediterranean. And we also need to be able to understand that there are actors who want to magnify this story for cynical reasons that have nothing to do with the well-being and safety of Africans. Mr. President, We're here to discuss the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. But if we are truly to hold to humanitarian principles, then we must broaden our view. The extensive unilateral economic sanctions that have been announced against the Russian Federation are almost certain to have serious humanitarian consequences. Their effect in total may even amount to a form of blockade. It is our contention that the peaceful means to settle conflicts advocated by the UN Charter do not include acts that may constitute collective punishment. We must also add caution that such considerable sanctions, rather than opening the path to peace, may lead to an escalation and broadening of the conflict. The only way out of this increasingly dangerous crisis is for prioritization of diplomacy to limit all military maneuvers and open the path to negotiation. It is still not too late to turn towards the good offices of the Secretary General, regional organizations, and bilateral efforts to de-escalate this dangerous crisis. Whether the conflict ends now or later with even more disastrous results, it will still require an appetite to negotiate a stable security order. At this moment, statesmanship is required, and we urge all leaders of involved states to embrace their responsibility. As I close, Mr. President, I reiterate Kenya's recognition of the inviolable rights of Ukraine to its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi, for your truly sobering briefings. What you briefed only underscores, I think, what the Secretary General has said, that this is a moment of great peril and great tragedy. Thank you to your agencies, your teams, for answering the call to help Ukrainians in need during this dire hour. In a matter of days, Russia's unprovoked and premeditated invasion has unleashed vast human suffering across Ukraine. We need to address the displacement and refugee crisis that we've just heard described. We need to address the food security crisis, and we need to document and address all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. This council just heard the latest displacement numbers, which have been rising by the hour in the last 4 days. First, it was 50,000 fled, then 150,000 fled, now 500,000 people have fled. This does not even include hundreds of thousands displaced internally within Ukraine. And behind each of these numbers are real people caught in a humanitarian nightmare unfolding before our eyes. And the truth is, no one knows where it will end. How many people will flee their homes? How many will need humanitarian assistance? How many will die? That is because we don't know when President Putin will end his war of choice against Ukraine. I want to thank the many countries and the people in the region who have opened their borders and homes to fleeing Ukrainians. The safety these people are providing underscores our common humanity during an otherwise dark moment of war. And I want to echo the calls of the United Nations Refugee Agency. We should help and welcome all those fleeing conflict without regard to race or nationality. Refugees are refugees, regardless of race or creed. Of course, not everyone can or will choose to flee, and those who remain in Ukraine must be ensured unobstructed protection and assistance. 4 days into the invasion, our humanitarian partners have already identified cash, fuel constraints, volatile security conditions, and logistical challenges as key operational constraints affecting all aid delivery in the country. We also need to be very concerned by the hunger that Russia's invasion will cause. The World Food Program warns us that the food security impact of Russia's invasion will be felt far beyond Ukraine's borders. The Black Sea Basin is one of the world's most important areas for grain and agricultural exports. Vulnerable people from Asia to Africa and the Middle East will face greater levels of food insecurity as supplies are disrupted, as we are already seeing. An estimated 283 million people in over 80 countries are acutely food insecure or at high risk, and this conflict in Ukraine will only exacerbate situations already on the brink of starvation. This is yet another reason why hostilities must end now. Finally, we are gravely concerned by reports of damage to apartment buildings and schools, as well as significant infrastructure damage that has left hospitals and hundreds of thousands of people without electricity or water, while bridges and roads are damaged by shelling. Adherence to international humanitarian law is critical, including obligations related to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Humanitarian agencies must be granted secure and full access to people in need of aid. Tomorrow, as we've heard, the UN will be launching a funding appeal, an appeal for this humanitarian crisis. For our part, the United States is already providing nearly $54 million in additional humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. USAID has been airlifting and positioning relief supplies, especially needed to help older people, people with disabilities, and people displaced from their homes to face the winter weather. This is just the beginning, and much more is coming. We welcome the commitments and leadership from other nations to ensure life-saving assistance reaches those most in need. No matter what happens next, we must do everything we can to help the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi for their sobering briefings and urgent calls to action today. The Russian Federation's unprovoked and unjustified further invasion of Ukraine continues to visit death and destruction upon the country and its people, inflicting enormous hardship and suffering. Ireland stands in unwavering solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They have shown extraordinary courage and resilience. This fresh onslaught comes on the heel of 8 years of conflict in eastern Ukraine, which had already displaced over 1.4 million people who relied on assistance to meet their daily needs. The Russian Federation's invasion has created a humanitarian catastrophe, compounding the suffering of millions with a rapidly rising toll of internally displaced persons and refugees in need of humanitarian assistance. Millions of people in Ukraine are grappling with the humanitarian consequences of a war not of their making. Innocent civilians, including children, are paying the terrible price of conflict. In Kharkiv, Kherson, and elsewhere, we have seen significant damage to essential infrastructure. This damage has left hundreds of thousands of people without electricity and water. It has deprived them of vital medical facilities, transportation services, and means of communications. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, the parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to attack only military objectives, the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. Ireland is gravely concerned by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which carries a particular risk of causing civilian harm in violation of these fundamental legal obligations. We are particularly concerned by reports of indiscriminate Russian attacks and shelling in Kharkiv, causing death and destruction among the civilian population. The use of prohibited cluster munitions by Russian forces has been reported. If confirmed, this is a further damning indictment of its military aggression. Cluster munitions are by nature indiscriminate, and we condemn all use of these weapons in all circumstances. Ireland urges against attacks on infrastructure and installations, including nuclear power plants. Such attacks would have profound effects on the health of millions and render the surrounding environment uninhabitable for generations to come. Any armed attack on and threat against nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes constitutes a violation of international law, including the principles of the United Nations Charter, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, and the IAEA Statute. We also express our great concern at the deployment of weapons and armaments or conducting missile strikes directly from the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Mr. President, the Russian Federation must protect all civilians in Ukraine. We recall its obligations to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law. The safety of all humanitarian and medical workers must be ensured. Humanitarians must not be prevented from ensuring principled assistance is delivered where it is most needed and when it is most needed. Ireland and its EU partners are providing significant humanitarian support, and we stand ready to do more. We commend our EU partners and Moldova for their generosity and solidarity in providing shelter to hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the war. They are deserving of our support in providing timely humanitarian assistance, especially to the most vulnerable, the elderly, the young, and the sick. We appeal to all countries in the region to keep their borders open to all of those seeking safety and protection. Ireland is already providing humanitarian support, including core funding to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, as well as announcing a €10 million humanitarian package in recent days. When conflicts rage, unpredictable, even barely conceivable outcomes can become all too real. Threats to unleash forces that cannot be controlled, including threats of nuclear weapons, are utterly unacceptable. Ireland has long argued that nuclear weapons offer no security. Their use would cause devastation in the region and beyond, bringing a new blight on humanity for generations to come. That is not a prospect that any of us should be willing to contemplate. Mr. President, we urge the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities, unconditionally withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from further threats or the use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other member state. In sum, we urge Russia to turn away from war and choose the path of dialogue and diplomacy. This is the right path, and the time to take it is now, before any more lives are ruined or lost.
Except that's not gonna happen.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Norway.
President, let me thank the Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths and the UN High Commissioner for Refugee Filippo Grandi for their frank accounts of the consequences of the Russian invasion for the civilians in Ukraine. We need your strong leadership in the response to this unfolding humanitarian crisis. Norway is stepping up our support to the civilian population in Ukraine. The government has announced it will provide up to $226 million to the humanitarian response. Let me start by underlining that Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis. Through its unprovoked, unjustified, and irresponsible military aggression, it has blatantly violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The parties to the conflict in Ukraine must comply with their obligation under international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law. They must ensure the protection of the civilian population in all of Ukraine. We demand that all parties ensure the respect for and protection for all medical personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, their means of transport and equipment, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. We are calling on parties to the conflict to protect all humanitarian personnel and ensure and facilitate safe, rapid and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid for those in need. The space for neutral, impartial and independent humanitarian action must be restored and protected. Fighting is going on in and around urban areas with the use of heavy explosive weapons. We are deeply concerned about the long-term harm to the civilians, including children and civilian infrastructure. Homes, schools, hospitals, water plants and other civilian infrastructure is being damaged and destroyed. We are deeply concerned about the reported use of cluster munitions. Explosive remnants of war will continue to kill and injure even after the conflict ends, and they will prevent people from returning home, going to school, coming back to work, and rebuilding their communities. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are fleeing the conflict. We commend the neighboring countries for keeping their borders open and for the great generosity and solidarity shown with people fleeing the conflict. The door to safety and protection must remain open to all those in need without discrimination. We will do our part, including providing support. This weekend, 2 media workers were shot and injured. Journalists and media workers are civilians under international humanitarian law. The world relies on independent and truthful reporting of the events that are unfolding. The heroic effort of Ukrainian and international press are incredibly important. We urge all parties to respect and protect the press, both on the ground and online. We demand the unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine to restore the respect of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, and prevent further civilian suffering. Russia started the war in Ukraine. It can choose to stop it now. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, USG Griffiths and UNHCR Grandi, for those startling updates on the catastrophic situation unfolding in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, with its unprovoked aggression, Russia is causing an unprecedented humanitarian situation in Ukraine on a scale that Europe has not seen in decades. We all know the toll of war. In every conflict, it is civilian populations that bear the worst of the consequences, that pay the high price. Conflicts equal with innocent victims, destruction, displacement and refugees, severe human suffering. Those who initiate conflicts do know this. We heard that the situation is alarming. UNHCR Grandi mentioned staggering numbers of hundreds of thousands of people on the move in and out of Ukraine, and all this in a matter of days. Women, children, elderly, and people with disabilities are currently the most in need. As this aggression goes on, civilians everywhere in Ukraine are terrified of what awaits them, when the rocket is going to fall on their roof, or what other ways this absurd war will affect them. International law is clear. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure constitutes serious crimes, and perpetrators must be held accountable. There is no justification for this war, as there is no justification when bridges are destroyed, when infrastructure is deliberately targeted, when missiles hit residential areas. Dear colleagues, we're happy to hear that despite hostilities, the UN operation in Ukraine has expanded. We support a strong and reinforced presence of the United Nations and humanitarian partners on the ground. We support the safe, unimpeded access and protection of humanitarian workers and the deliveries to the areas affected by conflict. Our messages are clear. Civilian and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Security and access for humanitarian efforts must be guaranteed. Safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its people is and should remain a priority. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld, in particular the four Geneva Conventions and their first additional protocol. Human rights violations and other crimes must be documented for the purpose of accountability. We commend all countries that are hosting refugees. As already announced last week by Prime Minister Rama, we are happy to shelter Ukrainians forced to flee because of the war. Albania has joined the wide array of sanctions recently adopted by the European Union. The airspace of Albania has been closed to all Russian operators except for flights conducted for emergency and humanitarian needs. We are working to provide assistance in military and hospital supplies to Ukraine. Dear colleagues, the decisions and actions of the coming days will directly affect the lives of millions of people. What is happening in Ukraine should not happen anywhere. We need peace, not war. We need friendship, not aggression. We are and will stand with Ukraine. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Oh, India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UN High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their briefing. India remains deeply concerned at the unfolding developments in Ukraine, where the situation continues to deteriorate. Our considered call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to all hostilities is an urgent imperative. India's Prime Minister has advocated this strongly in his recent conversations with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We welcome the commencement of direct talks. We reiterate our conviction that differences can only be bridged through sustained dialogue and diplomacy. We also underline that all members have agreed on the principles, the UN Charter, international law, and on the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. There is an urgent and pressing humanitarian situation developing in Ukraine. In such times of conflict, India attaches the highest priority to the safety and well-being of civilians, in particular women, children, and the elderly. We are of the view that core principles of humanitarian assistance should be fully honored. Taking into account the humanitarian requirements in Ukraine, my government has also decided to provide urgent relief supplies, including medicines, and these are being dispatched tomorrow. We remain deeply concerned for the safety and security of thousands of Indian citizens, including students, stranded in Ukraine. Our evacuation efforts have been adversely impacted by the developments on the ground at the border crossings. Given that the safety of Indian nationals is of paramount importance to my government, senior ministers from the Government of India are being deployed as special envoys to Ukraine's neighboring countries. We thank them for their cooperation at this difficult time. We stand ready to help those from our neighbors and developing countries who are also stranded in Ukraine and may seek assistance. We also support all UN humanitarian efforts. As reiterated yesterday, there is no other option but to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue as the only way ahead. I thank you, Mr. President.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I start by thanking our briefers, Filippo Grandi and Martin Griffiths. As a result of President Putin's decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a country of 44 million people is now on the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Whatever my Russian colleague claims, the world can see that Russia's indiscriminate attacks against men, women, and children across Ukraine and its disregard for international humanitarian law. Missiles have rained down on Kharkiv, with cluster munitions hitting residential areas and injuring residents. Disruption to supply chains has caused food shortages in Kramatorsk. The reckless bombing of an oil depot in Vasilkiv has unleashed toxic fumes in nearby communities. Violence in Kyiv has forced people to seek refuge underground, with many thousands, including the elderly and disabled, unable to evacuate. And as we've heard from the UN, today hundreds of civilians have been killed as a result of the Russian invasion. My Russian colleague may try to paint the UN's reporting as hysteria, just as they said it was Western hysteria to warn of their impending invasion. But let's look at the facts. 500,000 people have already fled to Poland, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, Slovakia, and other countries. 7 million people have been displaced, and that figure, as the High Commissioner told us, is rising exponentially. UN agencies and humanitarian partners have been forced to suspend operations. In this moment, as the High Commissioner said, of urgent need, the situation that the agencies face is impossible. The UK stands with the Ukrainian people during their time of need. Yesterday, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, announced $54 million in aid to help our Ukrainian friends. This latest assistance package brings the total amount of UK government aid pledged to Ukraine this year to $190 million. Last week, Prime Minister Johnson also announced the UK would guarantee up to $500 million of loans to Ukraine through the multilateral development banks. The UK will also participate in tomorrow's UN appeal. UK government experts have also deployed to the region to provide humanitarian support to those fleeing violence in Ukraine. But colleagues, we know that a humanitarian response is not enough to save the Ukrainian people from the disaster that Russia is inflicting on them. So our message today is simple. Once again, for the sake of humanity, we call on President Putin to stop this war and withdraw his forces from Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank USG Martin Griffiths and High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their very sobering briefings, which unfortunately confirm the images we are seeing on the media. Ghana expresses serious concerns about the unfolding humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The briefings highlight the indiscriminate attacks in civilian populated areas, which have spread fear and panic among the population, who have also been forced into shelters and subways. Children and newborn babies have not been spared of this regrettable situation. Thousands of people have also been internally displaced, including Ghanaians and other nationals, with more than 500,000 people forced to flee to neighboring countries as refugees. Ghana calls for the immediate and unconditional cessation of the hostilities, which have resulted in the current humanitarian crisis, and urges the parties to refrain from further attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. We strongly call on the parties to grant unfettered access to humanitarian agencies and to guarantee their protection and safety. We also call for the safe passage of all civilians caught up in the war and who desire to leave Ukraine. In this regard, Ghana encourages neighboring countries of Ukraine to facilitate the free passage of persons fleeing the war without discrimination and provide them with humanitarian assistance, including medical care, in line with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. We continue to urge the parties to accept the path of peace and seek an early resolution through dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. President.
Gabon.
I would like to thank the Undersecretary General Martin Griffiths
Oh,
and
it's
the
not a
High
country.
Commissioner Filippo Grandi. I thank them for their very
Oh, it is a
informative
country.
briefings.
Damn.
I welcome the participation in our discussions of the permanent representative of Ukraine. Mr. President, our message on the situation in Ukraine is clear. We do not want a war against a United Nations member state. Our message against the humanitarian consequence of the war is equally clear. My country is very concerned by the attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call on the belligerents to refrain from any and all use of the weapons whose impact would be indiscriminate. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the population who are victims of the war they didn't choose, the war they did not provoke. And we ask, therefore, that humanitarian assistance be supplied to the population in need without discrimination or hindrance. We, therefore, commend the generosity shown by the neighboring countries to Ukraine who are hosting the people who are fleeing the war. Mr. President, I would like to echo the note of alarm as regards the African students, including some from my country, who are fleeing the war in Ukraine and are encountering this process a discrimination as a seeking to flee and for refuge. We've received several reports of racism. This is unacceptable. We ask for the respect of the dignity and for an equitable treatment of all people in dire circumstances. It is the opportunity for my country to recall the African Union appeal for the respect of international law, who requires equal treatment for all people who cross international borders in conflict areas. Mr. President, the humanitarian disaster and the distress of the people can only stop if the hostilities stop. And that is why we support all the victims of war.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Martin Griffith and Mr. Filippo Grandi for their. Ukraine has deteriorated significantly in recent days, as the continued fighting results in damages to civilian infrastructure and civilian casualties and deaths. According to UN reports, hundreds of thousands of people are suffering because of a great shortage in essential services. Furthermore, many homes were damaged or destroyed, while residents, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, are becoming displaced or seeking refuge in neighboring countries. All civilians who are seeking refuge must be able to do so freely and without being subjected to racial discrimination. In light of the crisis in Ukraine, we stress the importance of focusing on the deteriorating humanitarian situation of all civilians, including by working to ensure the protection of civilians and preventing the disastrous humanitarian situation from escalating beyond our ability to address or contain. For its part, the UAE is looking into the humanitarian needs for Ukraine. Based on our consistent efforts to alleviate the suffering of civilians suffering from the conflict. We deplore the ongoing violence in Ukraine and reiterate the need for restraint, for a ceasefire and a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The continuation of the fighting will lead to further losses among innocent people, in addition to worsening the humanitarian situation, which is exacerbated by the extreme temperatures this winter, as civilians are fleeing the crisis, seeking refuge and safe havens. In addition, we urge all parties to implement their obligations under international law, including by allowing humanitarian aid to reach those in need and to refrain from targeting civilians. We also reiterate the need to comply with the principles of international law and the Charter of the UN, especially respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of states. These principles, upon which the United Nations was founded, apply to all member states, regardless of their resources, capabilities, or geographical size. In conclusion, my country reiterates the importance of working to reach an immediate ceasefire and seeking peaceful solutions that serve regional and international security and stability. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the briefers for their informative presentations. Let me also take this opportunity to express our solidarity to those left without home, water, and sometimes with nowhere to go, desperately attempting to find refuge in Ukraine, trying to alleviate the suffering of the population in very challenging circumstances, and we know that more could be done to assist you in your efforts. As we speak, hundreds of thousands of civilians have already fled Ukraine. Most hostilities are being conducted in densely populated areas where the risks of civilian casualties increase, including children, particularly with the use of explosive weapons. Civilians are being called to join the fighting, possibly with no proper training. There are pressing humanitarian needs for medical services, medicines, health equipment, shelter, and protection. Brazil calls all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law and uphold at all times the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, necessity, and humanity. It is of paramount importance to ensure the protection of civilians and of critical civilian infrastructure, as well as to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need and the protection of refugees and displaced persons. We also reiterate our appeal to Ukraine and Russia to facilitate the withdrawal of all persons who want to leave the Ukrainian territory. Brazil expresses its gratitude to Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, exit of people fleeing the conflict. Mr. President, for international humanitarian law, it does not matter how a war came to existence or who was responsible for it. What matters is to spare civilians and maintain a minimum of humanity in an already inhumane situation. So, beyond any discussion in the Council on the reasons for this war, we can and we must come together to adopt measures to minimize the humanitarian impact of the conflict. This is the minimum that we can do. In moving forward, it's important to closely monitor the situation on the ground the number of civilian casualties, and the immediate needs of the population. At the same time, there is no doubt that the best way to protect civilians and avoid a humanitarian crisis is to prevent conflict and, when it erupts, to immediately cease it. Any war will generate devastation, death, chaos, and fear. The greater the escalation, the higher the risks of human suffering. In the past few days, permanent members of the Security Council, the ones that bear the greatest responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, have been openly referring to severe unilateral sanctions, military actions, and nuclear forces. This must stop. The world needs these escalations to stop and dialogue to resume. The severe economic sanctions being imposed might have rippling effects in the world's economy, with consequences felt way beyond Russia. Possibly, the population in developing countries will be the ones that will suffer the most. The supply of arms and increasing militarization of the region will hardly promote dialogue. It will probably provoke more tensions. As we have seen reports on nuclear forces being put on high alert, I would like to recall what the International Court of Justice has once said about nuclear weapons. They have the potential to destroy all civilization and the entire ecosystem of the planet, and their threat or use would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict. Any use of nuclear weapons would have unacceptable humanitarian consequences for present and future generations in the territory of Ukraine and beyond. So far, we have received reports of around 200 or 300 of civilian casualties in Ukraine, which is already devastating. If a party resort to a weapon of mass destruction, what will be the number of deaths? What will be the extent of destruction? We have seen that before, and we plead to everyone involved that we do not see that again. I thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the
That was
representative.
well said. Well, speech. Good speech. Good statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank USG Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi for their briefings. What is now unfolding in Ukraine is indeed heart-wrenching. We call upon all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate the situation, and avoid civilian casualties. The safety and security of life and property of all civilians, including foreign nationals, and their humanitarian needs should be effectively ensured. It is of the utmost importance to prevent a large-scale humanitarian crisis. We welcome the remarks by the Secretary-General where he indicated that the United Nations will play an active role in coordinating the humanitarian assistance. In our view, the United Nations and the international community should provide humanitarian assistance in accordance with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality as set forth in GA Resolution 46/182 in order to avoid politicization of humanitarian activities. Mr. President, what remains most important for the time being is to return to the track of diplomatic negotiations and a political settlement as soon as possible and to promote a de-escalation of the situation. China supports the holding of direct dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, which is the ultimate way out of this crisis. The international community should provide favorable external conditions for dialogue and a political settlement and avoid exacerbating the situation. Any action by this Council should place it in a better position to play a constructive role rather than leading to further escalation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of the Russian Federation. We listened very carefully to the briefings by Martin Griffiths and Filippo Grandi. The situation in Ukraine is, of course, the kind of situation that gives rise to most serious concern amongst all of us. We can see that the ordinary people are suffering. The people who basically ended up being hostages held by the Ukrainian radicals and nationalists who are clinging to power at any price. Now, why am I saying this? Because in those territories which came under the Russian armed forces control, the people are not encountering acute humanitarian issues. The local authorities, after the radicals have left, are working normally and providing all the necessary services to the people. The life-providing services to the people are functioning. The acute issues are only remain in those towns where the Ukrainian authorities issued a criminal and responsible order to distribute arms to anyone who wants it, including criminals, the criminals who were let out of prisons for that specific purpose. And this resulted in mass instances of robberies and killings and looting. There's plenty of information about that in social networks. The social networks also have appeals from a number of heads of administrations calling on the Ukrainian authorities to stop this madness. We also note that there is many instances where later on the victims of the looters and gangsters are shamelessly presented as having perished at the hands of the so-called Russian infiltrators. We address the people in Kiev, held by the radicals in the city as a human shield. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirms that all those peaceful citizens of Kiev can leave the capital of Ukraine without hindrance via the road Kiev-Vasilkov. This road is open and safe. Let me repeat it once again that the special military operation conducted by the Russian armed forces does not have the goal of occupying Ukraine or harming the local population. Demilitarizing the country, which is crammed with NATO weaponry, is aimed at protecting the long-suffering people in Donbass and Ukraine. The special operation conducted by Russia does not impact critical civilian infrastructure. Over the 5 days of the operation, there hasn't been a single documented case of targeted destruction or no evidence of the death of civilians caused by the Russian military. And we're constantly being told the opposite, referring to some kind of credible reports. Despite the fact that currently in the information area there is a huge number of fakes, the kinds of fakes that people are trying to place on us, the blame for what is being done by Ukraine itself. And this tide of dirty lies replicated in Western mass media, unfortunately, very unfortunately, have become a dangerous mark of our times. Today, at this meeting of Security Council, once again we heard about the bombings of residential areas, hospitals, schools, and kindergartens. It is reliably known that the Ukrainian radicals are placing their attack weaponry in residential areas, which is a direct violation of international humanitarian law. We would ask Martin Griffiths and Filippo Grandi to please comment what I've just said. Everyone knows very well that starting in 2014, Russia and Russia alone basically extended assistance to the peaceful people in Donbass who were encountering relentless shelling by the Ukrainian army and the blockade by Kiev. We already had several meetings of the Security Council where we explained this approach of ours, and I'm not going to repeat this. I will simply say that we deeply regret the fact that even today, when we're discussing the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, not a single Western colleague mentioned the citizens of Donbass, whose suffering for 8 years you've tried not to notice. A very important measure of supporting the people of Donbass was a decree issued by the President of Russia, Mr. Putin, in 2019, entitled On Defining for Humanitarian Purposes the Categories of People Having the Right to Apply for Russian Federation Citizenship under a Simplified Procedure. at the time when the people in southeast of Ukraine were basically pushed to the brink of survival by the criminal authorities in Kiev, who organized a socio-economic blockade of Donbass. In this situation, providing them the Russian citizenship allowed them to receive social allowances, pensions, salary, as well as education and healthcare services. Currently, in Russia, we have more than 110,000 refugees from Donbass. They had to leave their homes after an event a week ago when Kiev tried to yet once again resolve the Donbass issue militarily, in violation of the Minsk package of measures. And the blame for this situation also belongs with our Western partners, who openly indulged Kiev in Kiev's rejection of Minsk and pumped the country full of weapons. Overall, according to the information we have, since the beginning of conflict in 2014, about 3 million Ukrainian citizens left for Russia. In conclusion, I would like to underscore yet once again that Russia did not start the war, that Russia is trying to end it. The Ukraine started the war in 2014, except that all these years you tried not to notice it. It was very odd for us to hear from the representative of France that the European sanctions on Russia do not violate international humanitarian law or the interests of the ordinary people in Russia. These duplicitous statements are something that we heard before in the context of other countries' situations. As regards the draft proposed by France and Mexico on humanitarian situation in Ukraine, we need to study the text very carefully before issuing any assessment thereof. In any event, please know that the Russian military will provide any needed humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians in the territories that have been freed from the radicals. I now resume my function as President of the Council and give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, Mr. Under-Secretary General, High Commissioner. First of all, I would like to thank the Security Council for addressing this urgent issue. Every new day of the Russian unprovoked war against Ukraine increases the human sufferings across the entire country. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to the Secretary General for his powerful statement and relentless engagement with the situation in my country. The Ukrainian government welcomes the appointment of Mr. Amin Awad as Assistant Secretary General to serve as UN Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine, as I know he has arrived to Geneva and resumed his duties. His mission will be extremely difficult against the backdrop of the ongoing Russian military activities that are often equaled to war crimes. At the same time, millions of Ukrainians will require his attention, in particular our children, women, elderly, and other vulnerable citizens. So I wish him and his team strength and mercy in their work. Distinguished members, let us be clear, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis. This war of choice is not only a violation of international code, it violates the conscience of the world. Security assistance is needed, but it alone is not enough. We call on the international organizations to provide us with humanitarian assistance. We call on you to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. Almost all speakers and briefers today were unanimous in their assessments. The situation in Ukraine could deteriorate sharply. Let me provide you with the latest available information from the government of Ukraine. Today is the 5th day of a full-scale, unprovoked and unjustified war launched by Russia against Ukraine. launched by Russia against the very heart of Europe, launched by Russia against the idea and ideals of democracy. It is the most horrible and large-scale invasion since World War II. In the morning, I told the General Assembly about the shellings of the residential city of Kharkiv by Russian Grads, killing and wounding dozens of innocent civilians. Now the residents of Kiev, the home of 3 million innocent people, and its suburbs are sitting within Russian crosshairs right now. According to Ukrainian Health Minister Viktor Lyashko, as of today, over 352 people, including 16 children, were killed and about 2,040 people, including 45 children, wounded. Russia keeps attacking kindergartens and orphanages. Russia is attacking hospitals. Russia is attacking mobile medical aid brigades with shellfire and sabotage groups. Russia fired an ambulance crews near Zaporizhzhia and Kiev. Let me say that again so that you can see this image in your mind. Russia is attacking hospitals, mobile aid brigades, and ambulances. This is not the action of a state with a legitimate security concern. This is the action of a state determined to kill civilians. There is no debate. These are war crimes. These attacks violate the Rome Statute, and these attacks are far from over. That is why I say this is a humanitarian crisis. As we sit here, Russian missiles are aimed at destroying critical infrastructure, which could lead to a serious environmental disaster and even radioactive contamination. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. None of these facilities are legitimate military targets. The civilian population of Ukraine is the first to suffer from such attacks, and if we do not act today, it will be far from the last. We welcome the statement issued today by the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan on the situation in Ukraine, the statement about his decision to proceed with opening an investigation. In his statement, the ICC prosecutor says that he reviewed the office's conclusions arising from the preliminary examination of the situation in Ukraine and has confirmed that there is a reasonable basis to proceed with opening an investigation. In particular, he is satisfied that there is a reasonable basis to believe that both alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Ukraine in relation to the events already assessed during the preliminary examination by the office. Given the expansion of the conflict in recent days, it is his intention that this investigation will also encompass any new alleged crimes falling within the jurisdiction of his office that are committed by any party to the conflict on any part of the territory of Ukraine. The prosecutor will also be asking for the support of all state parties and the international community as a whole, as his office sets about its investigation. He will be calling for additional budgetary support for voluntary contributions to support all his situations and for the loan of gratis personnel. The importance and urgency of the prosecutor's mission is too serious to be held hostage to lack of means. End of quote. To my colleagues from around the world, this affects you too. Russian military aggression kills not only Ukrainians, but threatens thousands of foreigners who are staying in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is doing its best to facilitate their passage at the state border, even as the border has become overwhelmed with the massive influx of people fleeing Russia's armed aggression. Temporary volunteer assistance points have been set up at the border to provide foreign students with food and cater for other humanitarian needs. Please do not be misled by Russian disinformation. There is no discrimination based on race or nationality, and if there are cases, they should be investigated. Journalists working in the free press also are under fire during live reports from the scenes of action and hot spots. A journalist and a photographer working for the Danish newspaper Extra Bladet were injured when their car was targeted in Akhtirka district of Sumy region. Ukrainian children are crossing the EU-Ukraine border without their parents and without powers of attorney from their parents. In this regard, we request decision makers in the EU countries to provide clarifications and instructions to EU institutions in order to secure free movement of and assistance to such underage persons and their guardians. According to the Ministry of Education of Ukraine, more than 350,000 school children have no access to education. Schools are closed due to severe insecurity in civil areas across the country. The numbers of refugees are being assessed. The numbers could be hundreds of thousands of people who have been forced to flee across international borders into neighboring European countries, mostly Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. It can take several days of waiting to cross the border, and we are grateful that more checkpoints on the border with Poland have been opened, including 2 additional pedestrian crossings for all who want to get from Ukraine to the neighboring safe country. Kyiv local authorities have set up a coordinating humanitarian headquarters to provide food and basic necessities to those in need. An electronic platform will be launched tomorrow. On this platform, businesses will be able to provide information about their available resources, and Kyiv residents will be able to announce their needs. All of this information will be systematized for effective communication and distribution of essential goods. Olga Stefanishina, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, who has been appointed as a government coordinator for humanitarian assistance, working 24/7. There are many urgent things to do, like to agree on humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians from the most endangered territories. However, I need to warn you not to be misled by Russian assurances of security. Russian words often, if not always, do not match their deeds. For instance, just recently we heard Russian politicians and diplomats, even here in this chamber, who said that there would be no invasion, no attacks on Ukraine. Hence, these corridors can be easy targets to the Russian army. To help people at the border, crossing points in western regions of Ukraine who are waiting for crossing for at least 1 to 2 days. To provide assistance to IDPs in western regions of Ukraine, including housing, schools, jobs. To provide humanitarian aid to civilians who remain home and now are cut off from markets, including in the occupied territories. Distinguished members of the Security Council, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis, as I said before. The Russian war against Ukraine has brought the entire region to the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Let me therefore repeat our call to the international organizations to provide all possible humanitarian assistance and to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. You have all heard the lies from the Russian side, lies in Moscow, lies in the General Assembly, and lies in the Security Council. Distinguished members of the Security Council and friends around the world, do not listen to Russian lies. Listen to Ukraine's cries. Listen to the cries of men, women, and children who have lived in peace, who deserve to remain in peace, who will forever support the whole nation's efforts for peace across Europe and around the world. Russia has tried and failed to defend its lives. But the people of Ukraine, with the help of the world, will never fail to defend our land. Do not listen to Russia's lies. Listen to Ukrainian cries. We need your help. The Russian ambassador laments that a dozen of Russian
both
spies
sides
won't be able anymore to enjoy all the
sticking to
benefits
their
of
own
American
story.
life while doing things incompatible with their status used as a cover-up. The Russian ambassador should instead
really
work
listening.
hard
Or not really trying.
to report to his
Seems
superiors
not even trying.
that only his cronies, a bunch of cronies, buy his narrative here in the United Nations. I want to conclude with saying that I'm looking forward to midnight, even though the midnight is the most dangerous time right now, because that's when the most of the attacks take place. But I'm looking forward to midnight, when this abomination, occupation of the seat of the President of the Council, will be over. I thank you.
I would like to now give the floor to Martin Griffiths and Filippo Grandi and ask them to answer the question that we put when we made the statement about the placement of heavy weaponry in residential areas in Ukrainian towns, and how is this in line with international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me respond to that, if I may, or try to. I can say that we have no confirmation of such reports of radicals placing such weaponry in residential areas. The fact is that accountability at this stage for breaches of international humanitarian law, which we must see in time, is naturally at this level of the conflict and this level of the violence, at this level of the uncertainty, very difficult to establish. We are truly in a period of a fog of war, a fog which obscures the futures of so many people of Ukraine. I made a number of points, I would add, in my remarks, in my briefing, about our fears of the impact on civilian objects, civilian infrastructure, as a result of urban warfare. I mentioned, for example, Mr. President, our reminder that large-scale urban warfare also requires the need to avoid the wide-area explosive weapons. We are very, very concerned at what we're seeing now in the streets of some of the key large modern cities of Ukraine, the way in which people are voting with their feet, the way in which basic services are being interrupted, and the way in which civilian infrastructure is being damaged. And we will, in time, I am quite sure, discover who did what and who broke which requirements of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
We can only hope, I guess.
Thank you. No, I wanted to ask Filippo Grandi, do you want to take the floor?
No, thank you, Mr. President. I fully support what the Undersecretary General just said. Thank you.
There are no more names described on the list of speakers, but before adjourning the meeting, I would like to say that whilst listening to our briefers, I was surprised because just the reports and videos and information in Ukraine, some of them are taken as fact, and others, which are obvious, the ones that we have in the internet are fully reliable, unquestionably reliable, are being considered inaccurate, unreliable, are considered not to be verified. Well, we're going to have drawn lessons from that and We expect that the
Free
UN
Palestine,
leadership
yeah.
will tell us how the Ukrainian activities are to be considered. There are no more names inscribed, as I said, but before adjourning the meeting, as this is the last scheduled meeting of the Council for the month of February, I would like to express a sincere appreciation of the delegation of the Russian Federation to the members of the Council and the Secretariat for all the support that they've given to us. It was a busy month. We managed to get to consensus on several important issues within our purview, although, as you know, not on everyone. I would like to once again thank all the representatives of the Secretariat, including the conference services, interpreters and translators, verbatim reporters, and security staff. Our presidency is coming to an end, and I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of the United Arab Emirates good luck in the month of March. The meeting is adjourned.
Good luck. Yeah, good luck. Is there anything else left?
It comes from.
To the procedures and fully informed about what's going on around us.
Mr. Ambassador.
Russia be trolling. At this point, like, I can't even tell.
We are working.
I think Russia actually believes that they are doing the right thing.
The consultations,
like the Russian people are convinced. Well, not
there is no rush.
They are convinced, but like
for it because it's a serious document.
Yeah. Well, since I understand Russian, I watched some Russian reporting.
There are.
Both are.
No, we will follow the procedures, and they are very clear. There are procedures
I don't want to say believable
on when the vote may take place after you upload a draft.
But it definitely.
I
well,
made
a
statement in the
how it
Security
can be
Council
convinced.
referring to the press statement by the prosecutor, so you can go on record and check
What
my
is
statement.
my opinion on
online.
Azov?
We welcome the
I
statement.
don't really know what Azov is.
Made.
Sorry.
We also
Is it
would
this
like to, as he
Nazi
does
organization in
to
Ukraine?
also invite all the parties to provide him with necessary logistic and financial
Yeah, I
assistance
know how it's
in
spelled.
performing his
I
duties
know very
and
little about it.
investigation.
Don't understand, like, it's the one that's actually harassing LGBT.
When I say rush, I mean that we should not really act frantically. We should act
The
according
guys
to the
that went
procedures
to
and fully
Maidan
informed about what's going
gathered
on
like
around
600
us.
of. Well, from what I've seen in the reports, they had like 600 people in during the Maidan.
We'll continue to consolidate
But
the
when
very
it
clear
came to
position
election,
of the healthy majority of this organization
doesn't seem like they
in
get
defense of
they
the
got
Charter
a
and
significant
saving
amount
this
of
organization
votes,
for the future generations.
and they were definitely an issue, like for people living in Ukraine.
Oh, you can go. You can go.
They were very nationalistic.
The authorities
like
of
Ukraine for
yes, can be
Ukrainians and so
verified
on.
by the authorities.
Like, you have people like that in each country, like.
No, I have no
it
comments.
Didn't seem like it was
they
like
will continue tomorrow. Too
a
early
massive, widespread.
Too early to comment.
issue.
I have no
Like,
readout.
people like that are
for
always an
security
issue,
reasons. Right?
Invade the
So
whole country.
see you soon.
Doesn't. I don't see how it could be this big of an issue. But they're literally Nazis. Not saying that all Ukrainians say, yeah, well, yeah, yeah, they are Nazis. Yes, I agree. They are literally Nazis. But do you just stand, like, do you just go up and shoot them? Like, that the solution? Nazi flag and Hitler pictures in public. Well, I'm not sure how it is in Ukraine. Like, I can only have, well, I only have my own perspective, actually. I'm in Lithuania. In Lithuania, anything that's that has Nazi symbolism or all Nazi symbols are basically illegal here. In public in Kiev. Well, if well, people from Ukraine, illegal. Like if you show a Nazi, like if you go out with swastika in public, you will just get arrested. The same goes for a hammer and sickle. Like both are illegal. Well, because Lithuania got another case in Ukraine. Yeah, well, you know, if it's not illegal, then freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Like, you can't have, like, you need to understand, like, radical people exist. Just because you don't like them, they don't disappear. And if you go and start, like, there must be other ways to deal with them. It just now it leads to a situation where no one is willing to back off, but where it's going is just absolute disaster. Now the West is arming the radicals to fight Russia. I think that, oh, yeah. Well, it's not exactly like that. It's a very narrow, well, I would say, because yeah, the West is sending weapons to Ukraine, and yeah, Ukraine has radical people. So you know, by that logic, yes, some of the weapons will be in radical people, and I imagine those Nazis will be the first in line to pick up the weapon. So, oh, maybe they will. Maybe they will be first in line to fight the Russians. So maybe those Russians will kill those Nazis. So, and maybe then Russian military can withdraw and say that they done their job. Their wet dream. Yeah. So exactly, they are the ones to go into the front lines, beating their chest and shouting how much they hate everyone. Like, I don't know. Military is usually where these type of people tend to congregate. Like I know here in Lithuania, I know people in the military, and they definitely said that like neo-Nazism is an issue in the military, but like that's where you expect these sort of people to end up. And at least here in Lithuania, like the laws are quite strict. Like military personnel is not only governed by civil law, they also have a military law on top of it, and they get punished by both, and military law is much more severe. So even if they are neo-Nazis and so on, they hate minorities and they hate LGBTQ, if they go to LGBTQ parade and smash some like purple-haired guy's teeth in, like his life is ruined pretty much. Like it's not something like a normal citizen would experience, because he is part of the military. He is trained to fight and kill people. Like if he uses that force on general population, like that cannot be a thing. That's why we don't have an issue like that. And from what I understand, in Ukraine, it's not like that. And neo-Nazis can get away with a lot of things. And yeah, that is a problem. But like, you don't solve a problem like that by invading a country and starting a war. Like, come on. Like, no one will buy it, even if it's true. Like that sort of justification, because too many things just align conveniently for Putin this way. Or for, like, Russia shed a lot of blood to defeat Nazis. Yeah, a lot of people, like, a lot of Europe, like, whole world, like, bled a lot because of Nazism. That's how he's selling. Yeah, I know Russian. I understand Russian. I watch his speeches. Like, yeah, I saw, well, like, problem about Nazism in Ukraine.
UN
The first time I
Charter
heard
and
about
will,
it was from
and
Putin's
all
speech.
states should abide to it. Greece strongly and unequivocally condemns Russia's unprovoked attack against Ukraine.
Oh,
Greece remains
fumbling to read from
steadfast
her
in
own
her
speech.
staunch support to the sovereignty and the territorial
I saw it in public in
integrity of
Kiev.
Ukraine within its
Yeah, I believe you.
recognized borders.
Like,
This
radical
attack
people are
is
radical, like,
challenging
that's why they're
fundamental
called radicals.
concepts of international law, the inviolability of borders
Pub
and
as
the very
bar.
right
Oh, in the pub.
of
Oh, yeah,
sovereign
yeah.
states to choose
Oh.
their own orientation. Respect
Maybe I don't go out
sovereignty,
enough.
integrity,
Yeah, I
and
don't really see things like that here in Lithuania, but yeah, here in Lithuania, like, no one considers it a huge issue. Like, you get a neo-Nazi in LGBTQ parade and he swears at them, like, maybe spits at them, like that's the sort of thing that the neo-Nazis do here.
we can make no exceptions
From what I understand, like, especially when I think everything started, like, the catalyst was the Ukrainians declaring Russian not part of an official, like, I think Ukrainian had two official languages, Ukrainian and Russian.
a unified response worthy
West is doubling down on arming Ukraine.
Revisionism is the main threat to
Yeah,
world peace and
the info war, I think,
where
is
it comes from.
winning. Like, Ukraine is winning the information war, and public opinion on the West is turning. And if it continues this way, I'm afraid that Western, like, people in Western countries will be begging for their government to interfere by any means necessary. And by that point, it's, yeah, the politicians will have to do something because they want to get elected next year, in the next election. Because it is controlled in the West, free media is dead. I think it's the opposite, like, it's, well, the media is controlled, all the media is controlled by someone, everywhere. But the issue in the West is, it's not even an issue, like, it's one of the virtues that is, I would say, it's of free media, like freedom of expression. Like, you can say what you want, you can, like, people are saying pro-Russian things freely, and people are, well, majorities are supporting Ukrainian side, of course, because, like, and the amount of information that is coming out on the internet that is pro-Ukrainian, and no one knows if it's real or not, and everyone is, like, just the amount and the quality, like, the information is really convincing sometimes. When you see a kid crying into a camera and saying, "We left Dad in Kiev," and when he is, like, in a train in Poland, like, how can you not sympathize with that? Like, you know, it's very hard to be objective when you see things like that. Shown because they want to. Yeah, I understand. Like, I have no idea what's going on there. Like, I just get whatever is chosen to be shown to me. The death in the Middle East don't count. Yeah. Now is everyone, like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, what's happening in Yemen? Like, no one's talking about that. Barely anyone. Like, whoever is talking about it, like, they don't really get much attention. Because, I don't know. I just know that it is a horrible situation. And, yeah. It's 10 times worse than Ukraine in Yemen. Yeah, I imagine so. It's been going on for way longer, so. And it doesn't, like, Yemen doesn't have any powerful nation backing it. Oh, or Yemen resistance force. I think the Yemen government is supported by the United Arab Emirates, I think. Or Saudi Arabia, I don't remember. Houthis have Iran, yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of atrocities if you look around. I think that's why people in the West didn't pay attention to what's going on in Donbass and Luhansk. Because, yeah, it was legit atrocities being committed, like citizens were getting killed and their houses being blown up, like, you know. But that's going on everywhere in the world, like, an eye for an eye makes a well go blind. Yeah, that is true. And I guess we have organizations like this, United Nations. They're supposed to solve these sort of crises and prevent this stuff from happening, but it still happens. Because now everyone's lining up to say how bad Russia is. I have zero faith in the UN. Like, I have nothing left to have faith in. Worthless organization. Okay, maybe so. Like, looking at the amount of atrocities happening in the world, yeah,
Mr. President, Secretary General,
can easily be said so.
in the evening of
But,
the
like,
23rd of February,
there's no way out,
2022,
pretty much, as far as I can tell.
in the Security Council
Like,
chamber, the Security Council being the primary organ of the United Nations that has the primary
it's just sad.
responsibility for the maintenance of
That's all I
international
can say.
security.
Like, that's the conclusion I pretty
Ecuador
much
learnt
came
with
to.
surprise and disappointment the news that military operations were beginning. The invasion of Ukraine was beginning, and that was a violation of the most fundamental principles of the United Nations.
Like, Yemen is even part of the United Nations. It is a member of the United Nations. So
This plenary on the 23rd
now as everyone's complaining.
when we were dealing with the agenda item on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. As I said then, I found value in all of these
And
statements
Putin made it so
before
easy to hate
Security
him.
Council meetings held
Like, he
on
made
the
those
31st of
speeches,
January,
the things he
February,
said,
and the 21st
like, made,
of February.
when you don't know the context,
Last two sessions
like,
were
for
held
as a
under
Westerner who
Russian
wasn't
presence.
paying attention to whatever's going in Ukraine, like, I had no idea what's the situation. I knew that they took Crimea, and that pretty much from then on, Donbass and Luhansk
undertook to
insurgency started.
peacefully solve
They demanded independence and so on.
using peaceful means
Like,
alone.
yeah, so
My country
everyone
has
considered
demonstrated
that to
it
be
is a
like a
peaceful
civil
state
war
and
of
for
sorts.
decades has issued statements
And
similar
looking
to
at
those
the
making before
at the
you
agreements,
today.
like Budapest Memorandum,
Because peace is
seemed
a
like
part of our foreign
it clearly states that Russia is committed to preserving Ukrainians' territory. Like, if anyone comes to invade or threaten Ukraine in any way, they are obligated to come to Ukraine's aid, as is United States and United Kingdom. Like, there were 4 signatures under the treaty: Russia, United States, United Kingdom, and Ukraine. And basically, all of the agreement is very simple. Ukraine gives away its nuclear weapons, and all these nuclear powers agree to come to its aid if its territory would be under threat. And now Russia is pretty much taking Crimea for itself. Like, if we can't agree on basic things like that, we can't follow through on our agreements, like, what's the point then? Anyone can do anything they want? That's the issue. That's how I see, like, where's the problem? Why can't we let Russia demilitarize Ukraine and take over? Like, pretty much invade and do what they want.
Bad because it
Because
causes
I see it like it's just a matter of time until they decide that like Lithuania has too many Nazis, and now it needs to invade and demilitarize Lithuania as well, and put in a proper government.
Ecuador has been unequivocal in its statements because
How do you back out of that?
separate those who, with their conduct that violates international law, produce and
like China is watching as well. As soon as China realizes that nothing will happen to Russia for doing this, it will just invade Taiwan the next day. And when Ukraine is thoroughly under Russia's control and Taiwan is under Chinese control, they will gobble everything in between. Declare a new... Hey man.
And other organizations.
Hey.
We support all of
Lucky
these initiatives because
Ukpul.
they may avoid the worst
So I imagine you're Polish, judging by your name.
affecting citizens of many nationalities.
What's your opinion on all of this?
Ecuador is concerned,
Madness.
we have launched an emergency plan which seeks to ensure the security and personal protection of Ecuadorian citizens with international support. This plan
I'm Polish, yeah.
has
Oh,
allowed
yeah.
us to remove
I guess that's the
from
case.
Ukraine students in particular, and we
I'm Lithuanian,
allow them to
so
return
we're
to
neighbors.
countries including Poland,
Poland is,
Slovenia,
yeah,
and
bearing
other
the brunt
countries,
of
and I
all
thank
of
the international
the
community for its support here. I would conclude by
refugees.
recalling the basic premise
More than
inscribed on
500,000,
a
like,
plate.
how long can this last?
A
Like, if it
plate
lasts
that's
for
on one
weeks,
of the
like,
walls
we will
outside
have
the
millions
General
of
Assembly
Ukrainians
room.
running away.
This premise states that in the life of relations between nations, respect for the rights of others means peace. With that in mind, I call upon all
I support
members
Ukraine as
to
I'm
support
against
the draft
Putin.
resolution
Yeah, I
which
guess
has been submitted
you would
for
be...
the consideration of this
I think you would have to search far and wide to find anyone who's who's against Ukraine or and for Putin.
will not hesitate to vote in favor of
Like,
this
how can you be
resolution
like
because it
everyone
respects
supports
the
Ukraine because like
international law,
there's a
and
war
because of
going
its
on
respect for the
in
principles
Ukraine.
which
There's a
underpin
foreign
United
army
Nations
invading
and
the country.
the
Like
principles which consequently
like
underpin
all
peace.
Eastern Europe can relate to that, especially when it's Russia. Like Russia been in charge here for so many years. Like all of us in Eastern Europe are learning like in our history lessons the atrocities that Russians committed. So we all sympathize with Ukraine automatically, and we all understand like we know that Russia is capable of invading and committing atrocities. Like, just because Russia says it won't do so, like, it doesn't really mean much. Especially when Putin says, oh, we are not gonna invade, this is just for drills, practice, or whatever he called those exercises. And yeah.
Mr. President.
The same day he was, they were supposed to have a meeting, like the invasion started 6 a.m. in self-defense. Like, it makes it. It feels like he did this on purpose in this way because he knows that. Well, he must have. He has the intelligence. He must have known that this is inevitable. Yeah, it's not fun to have Big Brother with Russia. Have them as a neighbor. Yeah. No one likes. That's why everyone is clobbering for NATO membership. Everyone is dreaming of it. All the Eastern European countries. It's funny how Russia portrays it as we are being manipulated by Western countries. We're just basically puppets of sorts, because that's what Russia would do. That's why no one wants to be neighbors with Russia or in friendly relations. Like, Russia just looks out for itself. That's it. That's the bottom line, and that's why no one likes Russia.
In Ukraine, caused by the
maybe Western countries are looking out for themselves, only for themselves as well. Like United States, like is the only country in NATO that ever activated Article 5, which is attack on one is attack on everyone. No other country has done that. Like there is no precedent. If Russia invades Lithuania, like who knows? Maybe they will decide that World War III is not worth fighting for like small Baltic countries. There is no precedent. Everyone says they will. You know, hopefully we won't have to find out.
Since the country became an independent state in
but yeah.
1821, it built its external relations
that's
upon the principles
quite
of non-intervention in
bleak
the
view of
domestic affairs
things.
of others and on the peaceful resolution of disputes. These are basic standards of American international
So few
law.
people here,
And we have contributed
Russia attacks
to
you,
the
then
gradual
polls will come.
development of that
Yeah,
law with our own
hopefully.
conduct on the international stage.
But I think polls alone won't be enough.
Unequivocal condemnation of the aggression
You
against
know,
Ukraine
Belarus borders both of us, and they they definitely won't stand in the way.
with our own history.
I know that Norwegians send troops. Like everyone's sending troops to the eastern border now.
Urgent
But
appeal for the immediate unfettered
for this to calm down, let's say Putin gets his way. Like one of his demands is to remove the military equipment from Baltic states. Right? Then we're basically a sitting duck. It would take as long to conquer Lithuania as it takes to just drive from one end to another. So and same for all the Baltic states.
Impartial and independent humanitarian action. Peru endorses the appeal issued
Now they
by
have
the
to like what I think is going on is NATO is assembling force or close to Russia to scare Russia off. Basically, if Ukraine holds off for long enough until NATO gets large enough force on the eastern border, I'm pretty sure by that time public opinion will be in such state that NATO will give an ultimatum to Putin to leave Ukraine and probably pay for all the damages and so on. And maybe if the NATO force is large enough, maybe Putin will be forced to back down.
Existence alone of conflict indicates to
I
us
think
that
that's
Russia
what's
has to
happening.
confront immediately. These tasks are
Because, yeah, everyone's like, all the NATO nations think, no, it's for defense, just to bolster our borders, to
the civilian population and
to calm down our allies on the eastern side. Yeah, but yeah, Putin said this pretty much the same thing when he was assembling forces around Ukraine.
on which this emergency
Doesn't it wouldn't be unprecedented if military leaders were deceiving hostile forces in the media. So not really. I guess only the people who are making the decisions and have all the intelligence, only they can know it's actually happening. We can just imply from whatever we're getting.
parties to the conflict.
Yeah.
We ardently hope that vital initial agreements can be reached, such as a ceasefire. The United
Vital initial
Nations
agreements.
Charter has as its core premise the idea
I
that all
have
states have the right to
Yeah,
ensure that their
very
existence in peace and security
doesn't look good.
be protected.
Like Ukraine is holding on.
The right to
The
be
civilians are.
but that
The
right
casualties
comes
will be mounting
with
up.
the obligation to respect these same rights in other states.
Russia says that it has no or few casualties. Ukraine doesn't disclose how many casualties they are having. Maybe because they aren't even counting. Like, how do you count casualties when you just give out weapons to regular civilians?
Back to 2014, must be based on the
Who knows
application
who
of
they
this
go and
principle
shoot?
and must
they
seek to
see
meet
someone
the
walking
legitimate aspirations
during the curfew and
peace
just shoot.
security
Like,
harbored by all
he's out on
parties.
the curfew,
Allow
so
me,
during the
Mr.
curfew.
President, to bring to the
You can
Assembly
justify that.
one of the core beliefs of Javier
Russians
Pérez de
went to
Cuellar,
Ukraine
who
unprepared.
I think can
Well,
be of guidance to us at the current time.
yeah,
He
that's
said
definitely
that
the impression
seeds of
I'm
war
getting as well.
must be
Because
eradicated across the
they
globe.
actually, well,
He said
look at it
that
from the point of view of Russians.
post-Cold
If
War
you believe
global
that
order can only be
there's actually
grounded in peace.
a small minority of Nazis that are running the country in Ukraine and oppressing normal people, like, why would they fight you if you're coming to help them? But that's obviously not the case. And the gypsies that stole a Russian tank. Oh yeah, I saw that. Dragging that. I think it was a BTR. BTR, that's the combat transport, like armored transport vehicle. I saw that being dragged by like some old Soviet tractor. That was quite funny. Like, there will be plenty of like. That's why Ukraine is winning, because of all the memes.
This charter contains the pillars and purposes that
Putin
are
sitting in a
crucial
bunker making a statement, and Zelensky going out on the
that led to
Kiev
the
Square,
inception of the United
making
Nations.
a
These
live
are all
stream
pillars and
or
purposes that as states that signed the
filming with
charter
his
we
cell
committed
phone
to
and so on.
defending.
Like,
My country would recall that this organization
people love
was
that.
created 76 years ago to protect future generations from the
And
scourge of war.
it takes
was
very little
created so
to convince
that
people
the
who
unspeakable suffering to
weren't
which
paying
humankind
attention to this
was
at all.
subjected in the First and
Me
Second
included. Like, I
World
haven't been
Wars
paying
never
attention
again
to this
occurred.
until Russia invaded.
Consequently, the
I
maintenance
thought
of international peace and
for certain that
security
Putin is just
is
posturing.
the
Like,
most
there's
important
no
pillar of our
way
work. We
he
must
actually
fully
is going to
respect the
invade Ukraine. Like,
fundamental rights of all human
like
beings, prioritizing
United
the life
States,
and value of
when
every
invaded
human
Iraq,
person.
it
is
took
clear
them
that
weeks
we are
to take Kabul.
obliged to refrain
So
from the use of force
now
or
Russia
the threat of
wants
use
to
of force
invade
against the
Ukraine,
territorial integrity or
which is like
independence of any other
second
state.
largest
And it is
country
clear that this
in
applies to
Europe
all states without
after
exception.
Russia by landmass,
Mr.
and it has
President,
second largest
as
military
a country, we
after
shoulder
Russia
the responsibility
in Europe.
before
So
several multilateral fora to support
and
regional and
expected
global
to
efforts designed
for that to be
defend
an easy
peace.
fight. Like, if
Guatemala
Ukrainians
condemns
are willing to fight,
in
like,
the
there's
strongest
no
possible
chance in hell that
terms
they're gonna take it
the military aggression and the unjustified invasion
without,
by
like,
the armed forces of the Russian Federation
especially if
against
they
the
act
territorial
well.
integrity
I imagine
and
they
people of
gave the
Ukraine.
orders not to shoot at civilians, avoid civilian
condemn
targets.
the
But
flagrant
whenever a
violation
civilian has a
by
weapon
Russia
and is shooting
of
at
the
you and
United Nations
throwing Molotov
Charter
cocktails at you,
of
like, how
international
can you not
law
shoot back?
and of international human
Like, if you're
rights.
driving by a
We condemn
apartment building and Molotov cocktails are falling on top of your
Russian Federation
tanks and
decision and
cars,
actions
like,
which have caused the senseless loss
what can
of
you do?
human lives.
Run?
The lives that have been lost include those of men, women,
It's
and
just
children.
it's just
And other
bad
people
situation
have
through
been
and through.
seriously injured. All are victims of this unjustified
Then
act
one
which
side can
continues
show
to
that
threaten
they're committing war crimes, the
just as it does global
the
stability
others turn
and
around and
security.
say the same
My
thing.
country stands in solidarity with the government of Ukraine.
I realized that
particularly with
also
its
Russia
people.
wanted to use Blitzkrieg
We
method
call for
to
collective
reach Ukraine.
actions and diplomatic
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what they did.
such that the Russian Federation immediately
It's
ceases all
it took them
aggression
3
and
days
all
to
use
get
of
to
force
Kiev,
against
just
Ukraine
because
and
that's
against any
how
other
that's
state.
pretty much the limit
We
of
also
how
call for
far
immediate
armored equipment can
withdrawal
go in one day.
from illegally occupied territories.
So
So
yeah, on
that
day 4th,
the
Kiev is
sovereignty and
surrounded.
territorial
That's
integrity
pretty
of this
much what all the analysts expected. Like NATO was saying that it will take 96 hours for Kiev to be taken, basically until the armored column arrives, and 1 day, pretty much. But that still hasn't happened, so I guess Ukrainians are really willing to fight, and they don't really think that Nazis in their country is a bigger threat than Russia. Obviously, they think that Russia is a bigger threat, so...
These actions have flagrantly violated international humanitarian law, and we've also heard that cluster munitions have been used. These have been
the question is,
banned. In light
is there a point where Putin would back down at all?
That these attacks are disproportionate and run counter
or every Russian has to die before that?
Which apply to all wars or conflicts. My delegation calls upon the Russian Federation not to continue with its military aggression.
I heard, like,
and to
French Foreign Legion allowed their soldiers who are from Ukraine go back to fight in Ukraine with all their military equipment.
In the rest of Europe
and
in the international community. Moreover, Guatemala expresses
how does that work? When you join French Foreign Legion, you get a new identity. You get a French passport. Like, who can check if you're actually Ukrainian or not? And their equipment, they use the best equipment money can buy. They are like the tip of the spear of French military. Like, they are the elite forces. They are the ones that go in. They are the ones that don't have to be counted if they don't want. They can lose as many of legionnaires as they want. So, and they don't have to report them as French soldiers if they don't want. Like, those guys are insane. Like, they're training. They cross deserts on foot as training. Like, and now these guys are coming back to Ukraine to fight for Ukraine with all of their equipment.
We cannot allow ourselves to repeat history. Guatemala is speaking out.
I'm not sure, like,
before this
Russians will not know what hit them.
Of peace and in favor of global security, with
if that's true,
firm commitment to leaving a better world for future generations behind us. Thank you.
I've been watching non-stop. I already turned off heating at my house, so I'm currently sitting watching this under a blanket. And like layers of socks and so on. Yeah, this is gonna suck for everyone. What I heard, the Chechens the Russians sent to Ukraine. I heard that all of those got destroyed pretty much in 1 day.
Submitted to the Security Council a draft resolution on the act
like, if that's true, like,
Russia has committed and is committing against Ukraine. This act is in clear and blatant violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4.
Like, there is the only one explanation I can think of is that Putin actually knew what he was doing. He knew what will be the result.
Or political independence of any state.
It was his goal.
The Council voted yes. One country voted no, the aggressor. 81 states co-sponsored it, cross-regionally. We thank all those states
wait, is this the conclusion?
Señor Presidente.
Of the pillars of the country World War without and to threat.
What does this mean?
News that threat of
does that mean NATO can get involved?
Mr. President, dear colleagues, last Friday, Albania and the United States of America submitted to the Security Council a draft resolution on the act of aggression Russia has committed and is committing against Ukraine. This act is in clear and blatant violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter of the United Nations, the obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. 11 members of the Security Council voted yes. One country voted no, the aggressor. 81 states co-sponsored it cross-regionally. We thank all those states for their support and for standing up to defend the values and principles and norms that make us friends, not enemies, that make us embrace peace, not aggression. We are here in the General Assembly today to continue our efforts and rally the world to condemn aggression and hold the perpetrator accountable. Dear colleagues, we stand in admiration before the courage of Ukrainians, men and women, defending their country, which, with whatever they have, in a war that they did not choose. They are in their right, and they will prevail, since they know that never in history did Russian tanks win when they were not welcome. This time will be no exception. The Soviet Union is dead, and nothing, no fantasy, no nostalgia, no war will ever bring it back. We condemn the involvement of Belarus in this aggression against Ukraine and call on it to abide by its international obligations. As the Albanian Minister for Foreign Affairs stated yesterday, this war is more than just a war for the freedom of Ukraine. It is a struggle for the future of a democratic Europe, for the architecture of security and cooperation in our continent, as well as rules-based international order. Therefore, it concerns us all. Dear colleagues, Russia has been warned. If you go to war, you'll face severe and massive consequences, and it's happening. Albania has joined the concert of nations that has imposed sanctions and other restrictive measures against Russia. We have subscribed to the entire package adopted by the EU. We have closed our airspace to Russian operators, have joined the individual sanctions on the freezing of assets of individuals up to the Russian president, which will apply to 654 individuals and 52 entities. Economic sanctions include restrictive measures in finance, energy, transport, and technology. Albania will no longer participate in any sport activity facing with the Russian Federation until Russia ceases its aggression against Ukraine. Also, given the worsening humanitarian situation, we have committed to shelter refugees. Dear colleagues, if we agree, willingly or by indifference, to let what is commonly agreed unravel in front of our eyes, as this act of aggression does, what respect do we have for what we have been building during 76 years since the World War II? What hopes do we cherish that we can continue to defend our rights individually and collectively? What assurance there is that we will not be condemned to be just a nameplate or just a dry number in this room? Instead, if we think and maintain that despite size, might, or wealth, we are equal members and responsible actors of this assembly of nations, truly committed to uphold norms and values, to show it. To do so, Russia must immediately stop its military actions, withdraw all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence with its internationally recognized border. And I thank you.
Of the Syrian Arab Republic.
What's curious about today's session is that despite successive crises and major challenges that the international community has been facing for decades, and where the Security Council has failed to take on its responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, Western states have never demonstrated so much excitement in calling an emergency special session of the General Assembly. This shows a politics of hypocrisy, of double standards, as well as one based on interests and not principles. The memories and the files of the United Nations have ample proof of the many examples of illegitimate Western intervention and acts of aggression of the United States of America and their allies in NATO that have caused millions of innocent deaths in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Not to mention the blockades that have been imposed on a number of peoples in Latin America and elsewhere to achieve their objectives. We haven't seen much enthusiasm for a session such as today's back then, far from it, quite the contrary. My delegation believes that this historic emergency session on the situation in Ukraine completes the anti-Russian campaign that finds its origins in the provocative and hostile rhetoric towards Russia propagated by the West to stoke tensions in Ukraine and to thereby compromise the security and territorial integrity of Russia. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic underscores the importance of resolving regional disputes and international ones through dialogue and diplomacy, and supporting the efforts to maintain security and stability around the world. We respect the principles of the United Nations Charter. The Syrian Arab Republic condemns the campaign organised and led by the West and their media against the Russian Federation. In particular, the deliberate spreading of fake news, of insidious allegations, as well as photos and videos that have been doctored, all of this to prevent Russia from exercising its natural right to defend its sovereignty and its security, as well as to protect its people. To prevent Russia and videos that have been exercising its natural right to defend its sovereignty and its security, as well as to protect its people, in line with the UN Charter.
Yes, if Russia
Some
has
Western
natural right to invade anyone, then
have gone as far as closing down Russian media. They have banned them to prevent the public in Europe from finding out what's happening. Since the coup in 2014, Western countries have ignored the historic links between the Ukrainian and Russian peoples. They have also ignored the suffering of the inhabitants of the Donbass region. This suffering that has lasted many years. These states deemed it more important to give NATO a zone of influence at the gates of Russia, leading to suffering in Donetsk and Lugansk. When Russia launched a special operation to protect the people there, these same states began a campaign based on the UN Charter and what it qualifies as humanitarian suffering in Ukraine, setting aside the deep-rooted causes of the crisis that they themselves are responsible for. It is a paroxysm of political hypocrisy. Mr. President, the escalation of the situation between Russia and Ukraine comes from Western states not respecting their commitments towards Russia, and that's been going on for decades. These states have ignored the legitimate security concerns of Russia and have not hesitated to provide weapons and missiles to Ukraine, showing tireless generosity and downplaying the effects of their decisions on regional security and stability. Nonetheless, the Russian Federation has always made pragmatic proposals and has demonstrated restraint in the face of American and European attempts, as well as those of NATO, to exacerbate the situation. These proposals, though, have been ignored, and Russia's security concerns have not been taken seriously. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, this is what the United States and the West are resorting to once again coercive measures, unilateral coercive measures, in contravention of international law and the UN Charter. These measures are simply fanning the flames and harming the people in the region. My country condemns the punitive measures and believes that being on the right side of history means rejecting the West's bellicose policies in order rather to preserve the interests of the peoples who oppose them and opposes their interventionism. Thank you.
Representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Wait, what? About interventionism?
And opposes their rather to preserve the interests of the peoples who oppose them and opposes their interventionism. Thank you.
Representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
These measures are simply fanning the flames and harming the people in the region. My country condemns the punitive measures and believes that being on the right side of history means rejecting the West's bellicose policies. In history means rejecting the West's bellicose policies.
Bellicose? What?
In order rather to preserve the interests of the peoples who oppose them and opposes their interventionism. Thank you.
Representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, India is deeply concerned that the situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. We reiterate our call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to hostilities. All member states of the United Nations are not only obliged to follow the UN Charter, but also respect international law and territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. Peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with these principles has been India's consistent position that has stood the test of time. As such, my government firmly believes that there is no other choice but to return to the path of diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has advocated this strongly in his recent conversations with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. In this regard, we welcome the commencement of direct talks between both sides. We reiterate our firm conviction that all differences and interests can only be bridged through honest, sincere, and sustained dialogue. There is an urgent and pressing humanitarian situation developing in Ukraine. The international community needs to ensure free and uninterrupted humanitarian access and smooth movement of all peoples. Keeping in view the humanitarian requirements in Ukraine, my government has also decided to provide urgent relief supplies, including medicines. These are expected to be delivered soon. India is doing whatever it can to undertake immediate and urgent evacuation efforts of Indian nationals who are still stranded in Ukraine. The safety and security of Indian nationals, including a large number of students, remains our top priority. The complex and uncertain situation at the border crossings is adversely impacting the uninterrupted and predictable movement of people. This important humanitarian necessity must be immediately addressed. In this regard, I would like to thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine who have opened their borders for our citizens and given all criminals to their homeland. We stand ready to help those from our neighbors and developing countries who are also stranded in Ukraine and may seek assistance. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Chile follows other speakers speaking at this historic session. During this historic session, the General Assembly will have to take action to guarantee international peace and security. The very fact that this is the first time in decades that the Assembly is meeting in this format bears witness to the exceptional nature of the situation and to the frustration of the international community at the paralysis of the Security Council and its failure to adopt a decision in favor of peace, a decision required by the current situation in Ukraine. As Chile indicated in the meeting of this Assembly on the 23rd of February, my country in its international relations adheres to the principles enshrined in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. As such, we unequivocally reject the use of force or the threat of use of force in international relations. Disputes between states must be resolved by exclusively peaceful means, in accordance with the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, Chile will support and also co-sponsors the resolution which is submitted in this special session of the General Assembly, a resolution which condemns the aggression against Ukraine. We urge for the immediate cessation of this aggression. We call urgently for the withdrawal of occupying troops, the protection of civilians, and for access to humanitarian aid. We call for the respect of the full territorial integrity of Ukraine, and we call for the recognition of the independence of the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk to be left without any effect whatsoever. In light of the above, Chile also co-sponsored the resolution which was presented last Friday before the Security Council. At the same time, I underscore that our national position on this situation has been publicly expressed by the highest authorities of my country and in the government's official communiques. Moreover, we are encouraged to learn of the beginning of direct discussions between the parties with a view to putting an end to the occupation in Ukraine. Having these discussions and is ready to support them. Law and peace prevail, seeing an increase of poverty and precarity in so many regions of the world. And we also are facing the challenge of climate change. Now more than ever before, to uphold its obligations, we need to champion our effective cooperation so we can achieve a better present and a dignified future for future generations. I conclude my statement, Mr. President, by recalling the preamble of the United Nations Charter. It states, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." And it continues, "Consequently, we will ensure by the acceptance of principles that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest." Many thanks, Mr. President and Mr. Secretary General.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers tomorrow morning, 1st March, in this hall at 10 a.m. The meeting is adjourned.
Okay, I guess that was all for today. Is there gonna be a press conference? Probably not.
We are living koji su oni zajednički.
Oh, it's past 1 a.m. here, so I'm ending the stream. Guess I'll be back tomorrow. Back for more of this? Oh, this is madness. When will this end? Oh, okay, whatever. it's sad through and through. Right.